what's the next step here, Rob? Just are you planning any more exposés or videos about the Perth Mint, or are you just waiting for David Lin to call you, or
it's kind of like
I have his number. I have his cell phone number.
Hey, let's just call him right now here on this recording. Let's do this.
Call him live, eh?
Call him live and say, hey, David, we got Rob here. We want to chat. Let's talk it out. Let's break some bread and let's.
When he invited me to Kitco and I went on there, everything was good. Then 2 weeks after, this whole thing blew up. I have not received a text, not one call, nothing from him. I think
the problem you have right now, Ivan, is he thinks that you're actually tweeting from the Wall Street Silver.
That's what I was thinking.
He doesn't realize I'm the jerk who keeps doing that to him on the Wall Street Silver account on Twitter. He thinks it's you.
I know, it's too funny.
Well, why don't you text him and say, hey, it's Jim. I told Jim to stop, but he won't stop. He won't stop tweeting at you. It's not me. It's not me, David. It's Jim.
Alrighty. Joining us back on Wall Street Silver today is Rob Kientz, the editor and publisher of goldsilverpros.com. How are you doing today, Rob?
Doing very well. Long time no see, guys. How are you?
Sure. Robert, you recently did somewhat of a comprehensive audit on the Perth Mint, and you uncovered some pretty interesting things. So why don't you give us a background of what you did, why you did it, and how you did it?
So I wanted to start off answering that question by giving a little bit of history for people who may not have caught it. I think it's a popular topic, the precious metals community, but for anybody that's new to it, John Adams, who runs Adams Economics down in Australia and also is associated with a local bullion firm down there and had a political career in Australia, had gotten reports from some customers that they weren't able to get their metal from Perth Mint. And that went over Twitter and social media, and it caused quite a stir. And essentially the story there was that people wanted to redeem their unallocated holdings. Now, unallocated holdings, that's kind of a, we can go down the rabbit hole there if you want the difference between unallocated and allocated, but the customers felt as though they had a right to the metal and they were able to get the metal under the timeframes that the Perth Mint had published. That was the story. So along a couple of weeks later, there is a chartered financial analyst, chartered out of South Africa, living in London, called Daniel Vigario, who contacted me and John about what was going on. And he, his experience, he's been in this field for a long time. He has, industry licensures. He says, Rob, if you really want to get down to what's going on, you go through the financials, because the financials tell the story. And he has that sort of forensic accounting experience to pull things apart. Currently, he's a director of finance in a major company in the UK. So he took 8 years of financial statements, he pulled them apart, and he found some alarming things. And essentially what he found was that essentially the Perth Mint had started an ETF in 2019. And in that ETF, he believes, by pulling apart all the financials and rebuilding a trial balance like an accountant would do if they're looking at a financial statement, to make things balanced. You have debits and credits, you want to make them balanced. So everything has to have, equal and opposite entries. And so those are published in financial reports on Perth's website. He took all that information and recreated a trial balance. And on that, he believes that they have seeded their ETF fund with those unallocated gold holdings. So now customers have paid money for unallocated gold, and that gold is being used to seed the ETF. And not only that, but that Perth Mint has a receivable of about 900 million Australian in metal, which they don't actually have to cover their positions. And if you net everything out, they're short of metal. They're net short of metal. And he went further to say, okay, they're net short of metal, but what about their financial position? Because let's say you had a lot of cash. Perhaps you could buy some metal to cover yourself or settle in cash or whatever the case may be. So he then looked further into the financials and said, okay, you're short the metal. Could you redeem it? If you liquidated your current assets and paid off your current liabilities, would you be solvent? And the answer was no, unless they pillaged the ETF fund. And wow. So they would not be able to make their customers whole, seemingly to confirm what customers had reported to John Adams. So we've done a couple of videos on this. One of the representatives, Kevin Rich, who's a consultant to the Perth Mint, who is formerly Deutsche Bank, and also had a hand in creating a lot of these gold and silver ETF complexes. In fact, the whole ETF complex around commodities was created at Deutsche Bank by Kevin and his team while he was there. Wow. So we've talked about the weaknesses in those funds. So he comes over to Perth, and he was on Kitco saying, basically, this has no basis in fact. So Daniel and I got together, we did another analysis. And he thinks that essentially Perth is running a scheme where they've loaned out customer metal and they're receiving interest on it. So they are in fact running a fractional reserve metal system and acting like a bank. So it appears as though at about the same time that Kevin Rich came over, and remember his banking background, they've turned Perth Mint into a bank to make interest. And their customers don't know it. And that's essentially what we're saying is they don't know that the risk that they're at, not only they're net short of metal, but that they don't have enough money to make everybody whole from a cash perspective, that they're dangerously close to becoming insolvent if this trend continues. Right now, they're just a liquid. They could become insolvent as a going concern, as a business. And further, that it doesn't appear that customers are aware of this. And when Kevin Rich came on the interview Kitco, he said, we have the metals and we're not running a fractional reserve scheme. And I think we proved using their published and audited financial statements that they're doing exactly that. There's another video that came out by, go ahead.
So devil's advocate, you said they loaned, the key discrepancy appears to be they've loaned some of the metal to an ETF that they manage, correct?
Yeah, so it's they've sold it to the ETF and loaned it to the ETF.
Did they get shares in the ETF that are not sitting on their balance sheet? I mean, what would be the purpose of them giving metal to that ETF that now creates this?
They gave metal to the ETF to sell the metal again.
Okay, but wouldn't they get shares in the ETF in
They actually don't own it anymore. It's owned by Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs, when they took over the ETF, stopped redemption rights in the ETF.
Really?
The reason they stopped redemption rights is because they don't have the gold to cover both obligations.
How much gold do you think they're short?
It's about $1 billion Australian.
Wow.
Almost $1 billion. It's like 900 something million. They also have about a $6.5 billion liability of gold that they've basically essentially borrowed to cover their positions, which has.
What would be the incentive for them to do this? Is there some payoff here? Or what's the
Interest income on the lent metal? They're turned into a bank. They're taking a small amount of gold. You know, think about the gold, the gold holders of the olden days. People stored their gold at a gold bank that wrote receipts. That was the first fractional reserve system. They've done that, and now they're earning interest on that as well. So they're putting all of their client accounts at risk because they don't have the gold, and nor do they have the money. Even though they're earning interest income, they're dangerously close to not having the money to being able to make their customers whole on their positions with their receivables when you take into account their liability. So in other words, if you liquidate Perth Mint right now, they may be able to make most of their customers whole by the skin of their teeth. But this is through 2020, June of 2020. The 2021 report will come out in a couple of months. And if the trend continues, they wouldn't. So it confirms essentially the fact that they tell their customers that they have the metal, that Kevin Rich went on Kitco and said, we have all the metal, and it's a flat out lie, and that they're earning interest income and putting their customer accounts at risk without telling customers the scheme. I mean, at least when you go into a bank, they tell you, yeah, we're going to loan out your money and your money's at risk. And if you read the fine print, you enter into a trust relationship with the bank and you lose some rights to your money. If you read it, the customer complaints at Perth were that they're not being told this. This is not easily viewable by most people. Is when they publish their financial statements, they take their financial statements and break them down into a series of notes and comments. Mm-hmm. What you have to then do is rebuild the balance sheet from that. In other words, they don't publish their balance sheet, but you can rebuild it because you read through and it gives you notes and it tells you what things are. Mm-hmm. And if you're following general accounting guidelines, they say, by the way, they're following IFRS, which is global guidelines. We didn't find a lot of support for that in the financial statements. And according to Daniel, if they were following IFRS guidelines, they would have to break out their inventories more specifically. But what they do on their inventory statements is they mix a lot of this receivable metal with the metal they actually have. And they repeatedly say that that receivable metal is actually inventories, but it's not. And it's a lot of word games that they're using in their interviews and also in their financial statements. But by rebuilding that trial balance sheet, we can show that they're counting on those receivables as actual metal to cover their transactions. And they're in their financial statements, they're purporting those to be actual inventories, and they're not. And the way that they do it is they write these really succinct notes, which don't delineate what is at and what they actually have in stock. And so a CFA is able to do that. Our auditor is able to do that. They're able to walk down all of that, recreate the trial balance sheet, back out what they think some of the ledger entries should have been based on all that information. And then that's how we're able to find it. So It was taking what John Adams did and the customer complaints one step forward and saying, let's look at the financials and see what they actually have listed there.
You know what, has Kitco, Kitco has they've interviewed now Kevin Rich, the consultant flack for Perth Mint, former Deutsche Bank, and we all know what a charming institution Deutsche Bank is. And they've also interviewed Dick Hayes now on Kitco. Has David Lin reached out to you or Daniel at all for the other side of this?
So no, and one of their complaints, when Kevin Rich came on, did the first interview at Kitco, they said it was irresponsible journalism on the part of me and Daniel because we didn't reach out to them. I didn't even know who Kevin Rich was. I wouldn't have reached out to him. I would have gone to their communications director. So I had
no clue who Kevin Rich was either until that Kitco interview. I don't know why he thinks he's famous enough or notable enough that people would think, oh, I got to reach out to Kevin Rich. I mean, who the fuck is Kevin Rich?
The point that Daniel and I made was we wouldn't, because you're audited financial statements. It's not like I'm a journalist and we're hunting down information about a story. You publish the story. It's supposed to abide by guidelines. The Auditor General in the government in Australia has signed off on this. Mm-hmm. And so it should stand on its own. That's a standard auditing principle. That's why you publish it. And so we refuted that and said, here's our credentials. This happens every day in the stock market. People take audited financial statements and make financial decisions 1,000 times. They write stories about it. It's normal. What we did is done thousands of times a day by buy side and sell side analysts. It's part of the financial industry. So to say that is disingenuous. And further, if you look at the Dick Hayes interview, he insinuates that it's an ad hominem attack, that we're attacking the members of the Perth Mint, and it's not an ad hominem attack. We're just looking at their financials.
This is no different than analyzing a 10K and then just giving your opinion on something, right?
Yeah.
Bingo. Yeah. That's the whole point of publishing those financial statements, is so that people can analyze them.
But I guess what bothers me so much about this right now, besides the obviousness of Perth Mint appears to be insolvent, or at least dangerously close to being so, David Lin and Kitco News, I've got a real problem with how they're handling this. I mean, they're only interviewing Kevin Rich and Dick Hayes, and they obviously feel like this was credible enough that they had to bring these two guys. They tried first with the consultant, Kevin Rich, and thought, all right, well, this is gone now. And then, like, within 48 hours after you guys doing your review and everyone else tweeting it about the Perth Mint, Kitco and the CEO of Perth Mint get together for another interview to insinuate that you guys are just a bunch of bloggers and a bunch of clowns. Obviously you're not, because they took it seriously enough that the CEO of Perth Mint felt like, oh shit, I got to say something. I mean, if you were just a clown blogger, the strategy should obviously be, just ignore him. He's an idiot. The fact that they're actually coming on here, and I'm looking at the thumbnail for the Kitco interview, and it says Perth Mint CEO versus ad hominem attack. And it's the ad hominem's like in red. I don't know if you saw this, but it's kind of funny. And it's a 44-minute video, no less. I mean,
what they do when they can't argue the facts is they turn it around and they attack your credibility. And again, if you watch the latest video Daniel and I put out this past Monday, we establish our credentials. I've looked at the South African CFA website, and he's there. I've checked his membership number. Okay, I validate his credentials on LinkedIn. And I've been an auditor. I was an auditor for 12 years. I was taught at Ernst & Young in KPMG. There you go. And so what we do is just typically what we have done in our careers, hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. And it's not as though we're a bunch of bloggers trying to establish some sort of conspiracy theory.
You know something? I'm looking at all of the Kitco videos going back the past 8 weeks. They did a 44-minute video with the CEO from the Perth Mint. I can't find, I have to go back almost 2 months to find another time where they've done a 44-minute video, because most of their stuff is little, 7 minutes here, 20 minutes there. They felt, you guys are so over, as Greg Manarino would say, over the target, right? You guys are so over the target here that they felt they had to wheel out the CEO within 48 hours of your video and spend 44 minutes discussing it on Kitco News. And Kitco never does videos that, or rarely ever does videos that long.
And
So
what,
look, I'm not a financial auditor. I sort of understand everything you're saying, but not at the detail that you obviously do. But I just, hey, message to David Lin if you're, and I'm going to tweet this to you, David, so I know you will see this. Why don't you just have Rob and Daniel on to give the other side? I would think that anyone who's pretending to be a journalist on YouTube, and I'm not pretending to be a journalist. I'm just I guess I'm a guy giving my opinion, and you guys are all welcome to have my opinion if you want it. But Kitco News, which is in their name, they're pretending to be journalists. They're pretending to be a news organization for this space. And I would think that anyone who aspires to that sort of business model would be under an obligation to invite Rob and Daniel on to give the other side, to present the evidence. I mean,
Yeah.
Is that how it works? That's how I thought it worked.
in the interview, the last interview that they did, I haven't analyzed the entire thing, but in pieces of it, when the CEO is making statements that we have all the metal, David Lin's not following up with specific questions about, okay, let's talk about what metal you have, what type of metal, how you've got it covered, how this all works. He's not doing any sort of analysis. And we're interesting in the video that David did ask him, how many unallocated customers do you have? And the CEO is like, I don't know. you think that Perth Mint auditors would have said, before you go on with Kitco, let's give you some information so that you can answer this information. But apparently there's no preparation ahead of time.
Jeez.
Well, I wonder, I wonder how much preparation David Lin did, because we were basically telling him when he announced that he was going to be doing this interview, I don't know, 24 to 48 hours before it happened. And he was soliciting us on Twitter, asking us for questions. And he got a lot of good questions, even people who have not been have been sort of condescending towards David were in good faith trying to feed him the proper questions.
Did he ask them?
And we did as well. And in fact, we invited them onto our show. We said, if anybody from Perth, on Twitter, I said, if anybody from Perth wants to come on the show, let's talk.
Well, that they've seen it because they're responding to you, right? They're not responding to you. They're going on a friendly outlet, Kitco, for a softball interview. I just was watching. I've watched about 3/4 of it was too long. It was 44 minutes. I got kind of bored. I'll be honest with you. The Perth Mint CEO response on Kitco News, and it felt to me like David was asking the questions, but was not asking the logical follow-up questions, which is critical to, if you're not willing to push back or dig deeper when you get a bullshit response, what's the point, right? And I don't know, maybe David's just was not prepared enough in detail. Yeah. Maybe he was just reading questions that his assistant prepared for him, but didn't know enough about the situation to actually intelligently push back. That takes a higher level of a journalist. Maybe that's not David. I don't know.
Do you think, Jim, they told him, hey, you don't ask these certain questions?
I wonder, because people online have said Kitco News has their own unallocated metal issues. And so this might be sort of David. I mean, I'm not ascribing any negative, any motivation to David Lin personally, but hey, we all work for someone, and maybe his bosses have him muzzled. I don't know. I suspect that might be the case to some degree.
Robert, is there any way of auditing Kitco's unallocated pools?
Yeah.
People have asked me, and I'm not sure that they have the same published financial statements that the Perth does. And I want to say one thing.
The Perth has to, because it's a public institution, or it's backed by public dollars.
It's owned by the government.
Yeah, so their stuff has to be publicly released, whereas Kitco, I think it's a private company. It's not a traded public company or anything.
Yeah, I would say, in fairness to David, I wouldn't have expected him to all of a sudden, take a class overnight on financial analysis or auditing.
Yeah.
But I do think if you're going to do a video and have someone on your show, you take the time to go through it, try to understand it, ask some questions. I think Perth Mint probably should have had either the auditor, somebody from the Auditor General or their accountant on the show provided some information about here's how we see the accounts. I mean, in fairness to the Perth Mint, they did print something on their website, but Daniel and I were able to pull that apart pretty quickly because in response to the first video, they did print something on the website, said we have the metal, but they were mixing the loan metals and the present metals and calling them all inventories. They're not inventory, they're assets, because you can have a receivable as an asset, but to be an inventory, it has to be in stock. And so Daniel and I believe that they had purposely on their website misrepresented their accounts. And I think they've done it on the Kitco videos. And I'm just waiting for their accountant to come out and say, no, you're wrong, and here's why.
Well, let's dig into that a little more. You're saying it's an asset that they're receiving interest on, but they can never cash in that asset.
It's a receivable.
It's a receivable, but it's in an ETF where you can't redeem it. And Goldman has control of the metal now?
There's a couple of things. There's inventory metals. There's ETF inventory metals, which is much smaller. They just started 2 years ago. And then there's the receivable, which is the lent. So the lent is what they're making interest on. That's where they're net short. They don't have the metal. And even though they're making interest,
they can't recover the metal.
Well, it would be difficult, I would assume, because, well, think about this for a minute. One of the big questions that Daniel and I had were, who's going to pay interest on metal? A dealer will not do it. And this is the other thing. In the financial statements, they claim that this receivable is consignment stock, meaning to like a bullion dealer or something along those lines. It can't be, because a bullion dealer doesn't have the margins to pay interest. It has to be to an exchange. It has to be to a bullion bank or some big party that can afford to pay that interest. So the other question that's not answered is who got that metal and why did they need it? Were they bailing somebody out? If they're bailing somebody out and that metal left and it was part of another financial transaction, I don't think they're ever going to receive it again. So that's why we looked at the financials and said, do you have a cash position to just go buy new metal in the market? And that's where they also run into problems, because they don't, once you take their current assets minus current liabilities, they don't have enough cash to do that. They would then have to pillage that ETF fund, which is supposed to have a separate, if you look at what happened to the ETF fund, it got bought by Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs apparently has removed redemption rights to that ETF. Why would they remove redemption rights? Because they know that they don't have the metal to cover. If they have to give up all the metal in the ETF to cover purse deficit, then the ETF goes up, right? It goes belly up.
Is it for sure that Goldman Sachs owns this?
That's what I've been told. I've had conversation with Craig Kemke. He said, yeah, they bought it last year.
No, they bought a management contract. They don't own, what did they buy? A management contract for the fund, or they bought the assets of the fund?
That's a good question.
Because,
as of 2020,
when Sprott takes over, like I've had this conversation with Rick Rule, when Sprott took over, I don't know, what do they call it, CEF or something like that? It's like they didn't buy all the metal in the fund, they bought the management contract for the fund.
Well, I think the point here is that it's non-redeemable. So how does Perth get it back?
According to Kitco.
Well, Perth got something for that transaction with Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, did they get shares? Did they get a...
No, Sachs completes its acquisition of Perth Mint Physical Gold ETF, according to Kitco, on December 15, 2020. They bought the ETF.
Wow.
The new ETF will be renamed Goldman Sachs Physical Gold ETF, and the ticker will remain unchanged. The product fees will also remain unchanged at 0.18. However, the big change is the ETFs, the gold won't be backed by the government of Western Australia, and investors also won't be able to redeem shares in the ETF for bullion from the Perth Mint. The new custodian, the gold-backed ETF, will be London-based offices of JP Chase. So JP Chase is your custodian. Goldman owns it.
Wow.
And they remove redemption rights. So what does that tell you about who probably got the gold on the other end of that transaction?
Is the government of Western Australia, and hence the taxpayers, on the hook for all this?
My understanding, yes, because it's Gold Corporation, DBA, doing business as Perth Mint.
That's even crazier.
It'd have to be a bailout, I would assume.
Yeah, unbelievable.
That's even crazier.
Yeah, not unexpected though.
Jeez, that's such a scheme. Sorry to say it, but like you're buying into unallocated accounts, then the taxpayer is going to be blamed for it, or who has to pay for it in the end. Like
that was the whole financial crisis is, back in 2008, where the banks take all the risk, and if they make all the profits, And if it goes belly up, they socialize the losses, meaning the bailout from the government is taking all the risk. So the managers are incentivized to just take massive risk for short-term gains. And up, if it goes belly up, we got our golden parachutes when we get fired. And the government of Perth or Western Australia is on the hook for our fuck up.
Yeah, and the thing about this is different than the mortgage crisis. The mortgage crisis has set terms in the contract. You take so much money, right? $100,000 on a house. The thing about this, the gold and silver, is there's price risk, because what if gold and silver rises? What if we get into a financial crisis? Gold goes 2,500, 3,000, silver goes 40, 50 bucks. There's price exposure there. You're liable for metal at fair market value. It even says in the financials, fair market value. You're marking to market.
So gold, silver goes up and they Perth Mint, whatever happens to them, taxpayers are even paying more money.
Their liability goes up, yeah.
Jeez.
Do the financials show who's actually benefiting from this scheme?
Well, we know the Perth Mint is benefiting from the extent of the interest earned on the loan metal. Who individually, they won't say. It doesn't say in the financial statements.
I wonder how much he's getting.
What's the next step here, Rob? Just are you planning any more exposés or videos about the Perth Mint, or are you just waiting for David Lin to call you? Or
it's kind of like
I have his number. I have his cell phone number.
It's kind of like the gift.
You know, hey, let's just call him right now here on this recording. Let's do it.
Call him live, eh?
Call him live and say, "Hey, David, we got Rob here. We want to chat. You know, let's talk it out. Let's break some bread and let's."
When he invited me to Kitco and I went on there, everything was good. Then 2 weeks after, this whole thing blew up. I have not received a text, not one call, nothing from him. I think he makes all the
problem the problem you have right now, Ivan, is he thinks that you're actually tweeting from the Wall Street Silver.
That's what I was thinking.
He doesn't realize I'm the jerk who keeps doing that to him on the Wall Street Silver account.
Oh man,
on Twitter. He thinks it's you.
I know, it's too funny.
Well, why don't you text him and say, "Hey, it's Jim. I told Jim to stop, but he won't stop. He won't stop tweeting at you. It's not me. It's not me, David. It's Jim." And maybe then
I feel bad for David, because I'll bet you his hands are tied and he can't.
Yeah. I truly think his hands are tied, and people are telling him, "Don't talk about this or that." And that's my personal opinion, is when you have a certain company you're representing and then the other company like Perth Mint is doing the same strategy path. It's like Jeffrey Christian, he's focused on unallocated accounts. We're focused on the other way. So to each his own.
No, Jeff Christian is actually evil. He's not torn. He is actually evil. So that's not in doubt.
The same thing happened where they're insulting Robert and crew over this, just as they insulted Wall Street Silver. And to me,
to be fair, we've been pretty insulted to Jeffrey Christian and Perth Mint also.
It was after he started attacking us, and calling us, all kinds of names.
Well, we were keyboard thumpers or something like that. What else have they called us? What else?
Fell off your motorcycle or something.
No, Jeff Christian's the one who fell off his motorcycle, not us. He said he's so smart, though, that even he could have a motorcycle and get brain damage and still be smarter than us.
Yeah, I think my whole point here was that you turn to insults when you have nothing else.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, hey, hold on, be careful. We've turned to insults too. So
but only in response too.
Oh, so it's okay then. Okay.
Yeah, as long as it's in response. We didn't start it.
Yeah, exactly. And we have plenty of criticism that's legitimate that we put forward.
Thank you again, everyone from the Wall Street Silver community. And again, Robert Kientz from Gold Silver Pros. Thank you, sir, for joining us here.
Yeah, happy to be on. Thanks for having me.